Tonight, we are going to follow a woman through her day in classical Athens, and we are going to discover that being female in 5th century Greece means living in a society that has simultaneously invented democracy and decided that half the population should have no legal existence whatsoever. Our guide lives in a city that prides itself on rational philosophy and enlightened governance, while maintaining that women are essentially defective men who require permanent supervision. She exists in a culture that produced great thinkers who spent considerable time theorizing about the proper place of women, which they unanimously agreed was inside the house, ideally never being seen or heard by anyone except family members, though this ideal breaks down immediately when you need someone to actually produce the cloth that everyone wears, or to sell goods at the market, or to carry water from the fountain. She is legally a non-person who cannot own property or make contracts or testify in court, but she is also the one who manages the household economy and raises the children and produces goods that generate income the family needs to survive. This is not going to resolve any of these contradictions because Athenian society does not resolve them either. It simply builds elaborate philosophical justifications for why contradictions are actually perfectly logical if you think about them the right way, which is to say, the way that benefits the men who write the philosophy. So settle in and meet someone who spends her days spinning wool and managing a household while technically not existing as a legal person, which must make the wool she produces philosophically interesting since it apparently materializes through the efforts of someone who legally is not capable of independent action. Before we step into this world, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy these journeys into history's quiet corners, consider subscribing to join us regularly. We would love to hear where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something remarkable about knowing our community spans different places and time zones, all gathering here to explore the ordinary lives that made history possible. All right, I'm going to pass you to Corey now. He'll be with you for the rest of this journey. Corey?
Let's start from the time of dawn as she wakes in the small house she shares with her husband and 3 children, the single-room dwelling that would be considered inadequate by wealthier Athenians but which is standard for working families who cannot afford the elaborate multi-room homes with dedicated women's quarters and courtyard gardens and all the architectural features that signal status and respectability. Her house has one main room where most living happens and a small additional space that technically qualifies as Gynekeion, the women's quarters where respectable women are supposed to remain invisible to the outside world, though in practice. This room is where she works and sleeps rather than a space of enforced confinement because poverty makes strict seclusion impractical. The pre-dawn darkness is total because artificial lighting is expensive and reserved for necessary activities rather than optional illumination, and she moves through her morning preparations by touch and memory, her hands knowing where things are through years of repetition. She rises from the simple bedding she shares with her husband, who continues sleeping because his work as a day laborer does not begin until dawn when employers start hiring workers for various construction and hauling tasks, the unpredictable employment that provides irregular income but which is all that is available to men without specialized skills or family connections. She wraps her peplos around herself, the simple woolen garment that Athenian women wear, though hers is plain and undyed because dyed fabric costs more and her household's priority is survival rather than appearance. The peplos is practical and modest, covering her from shoulder to ankle, the prescribed clothing that ensures women maintain proper respectability by concealing their forms from male eyes that apparently cannot be trusted to see female bodies without experiencing inappropriate thoughts. Which says something interesting about Athenian men's self-control, but which women are somehow responsible for managing through their clothing choices. Her children sleep in the corner, 3 forms huddled together for warmth, the oldest being 7, a daughter who is already learning the wool-working skills she will need throughout her life, the middle child being 4. A son who is still young enough to remain in the women's quarters rather than beginning the transition to the men's world, and the youngest being 2, a daughter who is at the age where she requires constant supervision to prevent her from destroying things or injuring herself through the fearless curiosity that characterizes small children. She moves quietly to avoid waking them because children who wake before they must are children who will be tired and difficult later in the day, and she has learned through experience that managing children's moods is significantly easier when they receive adequate sleep. She makes her morning prayers to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, brief words requesting the household's continued stability and prosperity, though prosperity seems optimistic given their economic situation, but hope is free and goddesses might be more generous than circumstances suggest. The small oil lamp is lit using coals preserved from last night's fire, the flame providing minimal light but enough to begin her work, because work begins before dawn and continues until exhaustion demands rest, the rhythm of working women's lives being determined by necessity rather than by preference or ideal schedules. She checks the previous day's weaving on the loom that dominates their small Gynecian, examining the cloth's quality, confirming that the pattern remains consistent, identifying any errors that will need correcting. Weaving is her primary work. The production of woolen cloth that she sells at the market to generate income that supplements her husband's irregular earnings and that makes the difference between the family surviving adequately and the family struggling constantly. She learned weaving from her mother, who learned from her mother, the skill passing through female lines because women's education consists of learning the practical tasks that women are expected to perform, weaving being perhaps the most essential. Since everyone needs clothing and household textiles and the demand for cloth is therefore constant, the loom is a simple upright model, efficient if not elaborate, consisting of wooden beams and weights and the accumulated expertise that transforms raw wool into finished fabric. She has been working on this particular piece for 3 days, the cloth slowly growing as threads are passed and beaten into place, the repetitive work that is simultaneously tedious and satisfying, boring in its repetition but rewarding in its tangible results. Her husband wakes as grey light begins filtering through the small windows, the dawn arriving with its usual indifference to whether anyone feels ready for it. He is a good man, steady when he finds work, not prone to the drinking or violence that characterize some Athenian men, treating her with the basic respect that is required in a partnership where both parties' labor is essential to survival. He is also her Kyrios, her legal guardian, because Athenian law considers women perpetual children who require male supervision, making him legally responsible for her actions and legally entitled to any property or income, including the money she earns from selling cloth that she weaves with her own hands. This arrangement would be more offensive if she had time to think about it extensively, but extensive thinking about legal injustice is a luxury that working women cannot afford. When immediate concerns about food and rent and children demand attention, she has made peace with the fact that the cloth she produces technically belongs to her husband even though he has no skill in weaving and contributes nothing to its production, because fighting social structures is exhausting and pointless when those structures are supported by law and custom and apparently by the gods themselves who are invoked to justify why things are arranged as they are. They exchange morning greetings, brief and practical because extensive conversation before breakfast serves no purpose. He prepares to leave for the agora where day laborers gather hoping to be hired, and she begins preparing the morning meal, simple barley porridge that will feed the family before the day's work begins in earnest. The children wake gradually, the oldest daughter helping with morning tasks while the younger two require managing and redirecting from activities that would be destructive if allowed to proceed. The morning meal is eaten quickly, the porridge adequate if not delicious, providing fuel without pleasure because pleasure requires resources they do not have. Her husband departs with his tools, hoping to find employment today, the uncertainty being normal because day labor is fundamentally unpredictable and some days he returns with money and some days he returns with nothing and they manage either way through careful budgeting and her weaving income that provides baseline survival when his work is scarce. Once he is gone, the household becomes her domain entirely, the space transforming from family quarters to workplace, the children's presence adding complications but not preventing the work that must be done. Her oldest daughter settles with the spindle, learning to spin raw wool into thread, the fundamental skill that precedes weaving, her small hands not yet producing thread of consistent quality but improving with practice, the learning process that her mother guides with patient corrections and demonstrations. The wool they work with was purchased at the market, already cleaned and prepared for spinning, because they do not own sheep and purchasing prepared wool is more economical than trying to process raw fleece in their small house. The wool is coarse, suitable for everyday cloth rather than fine garments, because fine wool is expensive and their market is working Athenians who need functional clothing rather than status displays. She works at the loom while her daughter spins, the two of them engaged in the complementary tasks that transform wool into cloth, their labor coordinated through the practiced rhythm of people who work together regularly. The middle son plays with simple wooden toys, required to remain quiet and occupied, learning early the expectation that children should not disturb adult work. The youngest daughter is more challenging, attempting to grab the spindle or pull threads from the loom or otherwise participate in ways that are enthusiastic but unhelpful. This is the reality of working at home with young children, the constant balance between maintaining productivity and managing small humans who have their own agendas and who do not understand or care that their mother's work generates income the family needs. She manages through patience and creative distraction and occasional firm redirection, the skills that mothers develop through necessity and that no one teaches formally but which everyone must learn. The morning progresses through its familiar pattern, threads accumulating on the spindle, cloth growing on the loom, children requiring periodic intervention to prevent disasters. The work is repetitive and physically demanding, the standing position at the loom creating back strain, the fine motor control required for consistent weaving causing hand fatigue, but these discomforts are simply part of working life and complaining about them serves no purpose. Around mid-morning she must interrupt her weaving to fetch water from the public fountain, a task that cannot be postponed because the household needs water for drinking and cooking and washing, and the fountain is not conveniently located next to her house, but rather requires walking through several streets to reach the nearest public water source. This necessity to leave the house and be publicly visible is technically improper for respectable women who should remain secluded, but obviously someone must fetch water and men are too busy with important activities like politics and philosophy to perform such menial tasks. So women fetch water and everyone pretends not to notice the contradiction. She takes her water jar, a large clay amphora that will be heavy when full, and makes her way through Athens' narrow streets toward the fountain. Her oldest daughter accompanies her, learning the route and the task, while the younger children stay home because taking 3 children to fetch water would be chaotic and impractical. Leaving young children unsupervised is not ideal, but is also standard practice among working families who have limited alternatives and who trust that the children will survive brief periods without direct oversight. The streets of Athens are already active with morning commerce, men conducting business and discussing politics and engaging in the public life that is their domain. She moves through this space with the practiced invisibility of women who have learned to be present without calling attention to themselves, keeping eyes lowered, moving purposefully, signaling through posture and demeanor that she is engaged in necessary errands rather than inappropriately loitering. Other women are also moving through the streets on similar errands, water carriers and market goers and the occasional female slave running household tasks, the necessary presence of women in public spaces that Athenian ideals pretend does not exist. They acknowledge each other with small nods, the recognition of shared position, members of the same class navigating the same constraints. The fountain is a gathering place for women, one of the few public spaces where female presence is expected and accepted, though accepted might overstate how men feel about clusters of women talking together, which they view with suspicion because apparently women gathering without male supervision might discuss things that men would prefer remained undiscussed. The fountain is therefore simultaneously a necessary civic amenity and a source of male anxiety about what women might be plotting. Several women are already at the fountain when she arrives, filling their jars and exchanging news and gossip. The informal information network that connects Athenian women despite their supposed seclusion. She greets them and waits her turn at the spout, listening to the conversation that flows as freely as the water, learning about neighborhood events and household news and the general intelligence that circulates through these female networks. One woman mentions that her husband was hired for several days of well-paying work, and the others congratulate her genuinely because when one family in their economic class does well, it gives hope that others might also experience good fortune. Another woman complains about her mother-in-law's impossible standards for household management, and the others commiserate because difficult in-laws are universal human experience transcending culture and time period. A third mentions hearing that a wealthy family is looking to purchase substantial quantities of cloth, and she files this information away as potentially relevant to her weaving business. The conversation is interrupted by a group of men passing nearby, and the women fall quiet automatically, because women talking and laughing together makes men uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men can create problems for women, so avoiding male attention is standard practice. The men pass without incident, and the conversation resumes, though more quietly, everyone aware that drawing attention is unwise. Her turn comes and she fills her amphora, the water cold and clean, the jar growing heavy as it fills, once full. She hoists it with practiced effort, balancing the weight carefully, preparing for the walk back home, carrying perhaps 20 pounds of water that the household will use throughout the day. Her daughter helps by carrying a smaller jar, learning through participation the tasks she will perform throughout her own life. The walk back home is slower than the walk to the fountain because carrying heavy water requires careful movement to avoid spilling or dropping the jar, which would mean wasting water and possibly breaking the jar, either of which would be small disasters for a household operating on narrow margins. They navigate the streets carefully, the daughter watching her mother's technique, learning how to balance weight and manage the awkward load. Back at the house, the younger children have survived her absence without destroying anything important, which counts as success in household management. The water is stored in large jars for later use, and she returns to her weaving, resuming the work that was interrupted but that must continue because cloth production does not pause for errands or interruptions. It simply continues whenever possible because income depends on producing quantities that can be sold. The weaving progresses through midday, the cloth growing gradually, the pattern emerging from accumulated threads and careful attention. Her daughter continues spinning, the pile of prepared thread growing alongside the expanding cloth, mother and daughter working in parallel toward the shared goal of producing sellable goods that will generate income. Around midday, her husband returns looking pleased, having been hired for afternoon work. Good news, that means today will generate income and that tonight's meal might include more than basic grains and vegetables. He eats quickly the food she has prepared, bread and olives and cheese, simple but adequate, then departs again for his afternoon labor, the brief home visit being standard when work is found at a distance from the house. The afternoon brings more weaving, more spinning, more managing children who are increasingly restless from being required to remain relatively quiet and contained all day. She balances productivity with child management, maintaining enough forward progress on the cloth while also ensuring the children are fed and supervised and prevented from the various disasters they would create if left entirely to their own devices. B. While 8 afternoon, the piece she has been working on is nearly complete, the cloth reaching the length she planned, the quality consistent throughout. Tomorrow she will cut it from the loom and prepare it for sale, taking it to the market where she will negotiate with buyers, the public commercial activity that is technically improper for women but which is also necessary because someone must sell the goods, and her husband lacks both the time and the knowledge to market cloth effectively. The evening approaches and she begins preparing the evening meal, the main meal of the day when the family gathers and eats together. Her husband returns from his work looking tired but satisfied with the day's earnings, and they eat together while the children chatter about their day, and she feels the satisfaction of a day's work completed competently. The small victory of surviving another day while producing value and managing household and maintaining the delicate balance that working women must maintain between propriety and economic necessity. After the meal, the evening routine proceeds towards sleep, children being settled, preparations being made for tomorrow, the perpetual cycle of work and rest and work again that defines her existence. She is tired from the day's physical labor, from the standing and weaving and water carrying and child managing, but it is the productive tiredness that comes from accomplishing necessary work rather than the exhausted tiredness that comes from futile effort. She settles into her sleeping space in the Gynecian, her husband in the main room as is proper, since men and women maintain separate sleeping arrangements in respectable households, or at least in respectable households wealthy enough to have multiple rooms, though in practice their small house makes this separation more theoretical than actual. Sleep comes quickly despite the hard sleeping surface, exhaustion overriding discomfort, her body claiming the rest it needs to prepare for tomorrow's similar demands. She wakes the next morning to the same pre-dawn darkness, the same routine. of rising before the household truly needs her awake, but when her internal sense tells her that delaying further would make the day's tasks impossible to complete. Her husband sleeps beside her in the small space, his breathing steady and deep, exhausted from yesterday's labor and needing rest before today's attempt to find more work, the endless cycle of physical exertion in exchange for coins that never quite accumulate into security. The children are still asleep as well, three small forms creating their own warmth through proximity, and she allows herself a moment of simply observing them before the day's demands begin. Her oldest daughter is growing rapidly, her face losing the roundness of childhood and beginning to show the bone structure of the woman she will become, the transformation both pleasing and slightly melancholy because childhood is brief and adulthood brings responsibilities that cannot be postponed or avoided. She rises and begins her preparations, moving through the familiar sequence of actions that start each day, lighting the lamp from preserved coals, checking the loom, mentally reviewing what must be accomplished before evening arrives and makes continued work impractical. Today she must finish the cloth she has been weaving and prepare it for market, which means today she will venture into the agora to conduct business, the public commercial activity that respectable women should avoid but which economic necessity makes unavoidable. The morning meal is prepared and consumed with the usual efficiency, everyone eating quickly because lingering over food is luxury that working families cannot afford. Her husband departs for his daily attempt to find employment, his tools carried over his shoulder, his expression neither optimistic nor pessimistic but simply resigned to whatever the day will bring. The children finish eating and the older two settle into their morning routines, her daughter with the spindle and her son with his toys, while the youngest requires constant redirection from activities that would be destructive if allowed to proceed. She returns to the loom and completes the final section of cloth, the weaving that began 3 days ago now reaching its planned completion, the piece ready to be cut from the loom and prepared for sale. This cutting is always slightly anxious moment because errors in measurement or cutting would reduce the cloth's value or make it unsellable, but she has done this enough times that her hands know what to do, and the cloth comes free from the loom cleanly, ready for the next stage of processing. The cloth must be folded carefully to display its quality without creating permanent creases that would suggest poor handling. She folds it with precise attention, creating a package that will show buyers the weave's consistency and the wool's quality while remaining compact enough to carry easily. This presentation matters because buyers judge cloth partially by its appearance and partially by how it is presented, the vendor's competence being evaluated alongside the product's quality. Her daughter watches this process carefully, learning not just the mechanical folding but the judgment required to present goods effectively, the accumulated knowledge that transforms simple craft into successful business. This knowledge is never written down because women's commercial knowledge is not considered worthy of documentation, but it is nevertheless real and valuable and essential to the household's economic survival. The preparation complete, she must now plan her market trip, which requires several decisions about timing and logistics. She cannot take all three children with her because managing three children while conducting business would be impossible, but she also cannot leave all three unsupervised for the hours the trip will require. The solution is to take her oldest daughter, who is old enough to be helpful and who needs to learn market skills, while leaving the younger two with a neighbor woman who will watch them in exchange for similar service when the neighbor needs childcare. This informal childcare exchange is standard among working women who must leave their homes for various errands and who cannot afford to hire help but who have developed networks of mutual assistance that make survival possible. The neighbor is a widow with her own grown children who is willing to watch small children for a few hours, and she has watched her neighbor's children many times, creating a balance of favors that benefits both households. The arrangements made, she gathers her package of cloth and sets out with her daughter through Athens' morning streets toward the Agora, the commercial and civic center where all significant business occurs. The walk takes perhaps 20 minutes, time she uses to instruct her daughter about market behavior and negotiation tactics, the practical education that will serve her throughout her life. The agora is already active when they arrive, vendors setting up stalls, buyers beginning their shopping, the general organized chaos of commercial activity beginning another day. The space is predominantly male, which is expected since men conduct most public business, but women vendors are not entirely absent, particularly women selling cloth or food or other goods associated with female production. Their presence is tolerated rather than welcomed, accepted as economic necessity rather than as proper female behavior. She locates an open space where she can display her cloth, spreading it carefully to show its quality, positioning herself where passing buyers might notice without her having to actively call attention, because women calling out to attract buyers would be considered inappropriate and might damage her reputation as respectable vendor. This is the delicate balance that working women must maintain, being visible enough to conduct business but not so visible as to seem improper, aggressive enough to make sales but not so aggressive as to appear unwomanly. Her daughter stands beside her, observing how her mother interacts with potential buyers, learning the subtle art of commercial negotiation conducted within the constraints of feminine respectability. A potential buyer approaches, examines the cloth, asks about its production and its price, and she provides information while maintaining the demure demeanor that signals respectability even while conducting business in public space. The negotiation proceeds through the standard pattern, the buyer questioning the quality and suggesting the price is too high, she defending the quality and explaining that the price reflects fair value for well-made cloth, both parties engaging in the ritual of haggling that determines final price. Eventually, they reach agreement at a price that is slightly lower than she initially requested but higher than the buyer's first offer, the compromise that characterizes successful negotiations. The sale complete, she receives payment in coins that she tucks carefully into her belt, the money representing 3 days of weaving labor now converted into portable value. This money technically belongs to her husband as her curios, but in practice she manages it as part of the household economy, using it to purchase necessities and to supplement his irregular income, the practical arrangement that operates beneath the legal fiction that he owns everything. More buyers approach throughout the morning, some examining the cloth and moving on, others negotiating and purchasing, the unpredictable flow of commercial activity that makes market selling both nerve-wracking and occasionally profitable. She makes several sales, each one reducing her inventory and increasing her coin purse, the tangible evidence that her labor has value that others recognize and will pay for. Between customers, she observes the market's general activity, the vast array of goods being sold and the varied people conducting business. Food vendors sell bread and olives and fish, their goods displayed to attract buyers. Potters sell their wares, ceramic vessels of varying quality and price. Metalworkers display tools and implements, the products of specialized craft that command higher prices than simple cloth but that also require more specialized knowledge to produce. She also observes the male citizens who populate the agora. Men conducting business and discussing politics and philosophy and engaging in the public life that is their exclusive domain. They pass through the commercial area with the casual confidence of people who belong here, whose presence is expected and appropriate, not needing to maintain demure behavior or signal respectability because their gender grants automatic legitimacy to their presence. This observation is not bitter exactly, more resigned acceptance of how the world is arranged, the fundamental unfairness that she cannot change and that wastes energy to dwell upon. Men have the agora and the assembly and the courts and the symposia and all the spaces of public life. Women have the house and the loom and the occasional necessary ventures into public space that must be conducted as invisibly as possible. These are simply the rules, as immutable as the seasons, and she has learned to operate within them rather than exhausting herself fighting them. Around midday her remaining cloth is sold, the last piece going to a buyer who seems pleased with his purchase and who promises to return when she has new inventory, the kind of repeat customer relationship that provides some stability to the unpredictable business of market selling. She counts her earnings carefully, confirming the amount, feeling satisfaction at having converted her labor into money that will help sustain her household. The market trip complete, she and her daughter begin the walk back home, stopping briefly at vendors to purchase food for the coming days, bread and vegetables and a small amount of fish that will provide variety to their usual diet. These purchases consume some of her earnings, but feeding the family is the money's purpose, and she budgets carefully to ensure adequate nutrition while preserving enough coins for future needs. They retrieve the younger children from the neighbor who reports that they were adequately behaved, though the youngest attempted to escape supervision several times, which sounds accurate for a 2-year-old who considers boundaries more as suggestions than as rules. She thanks the neighbor and makes mental note that she owes return childcare service, the informal accounting that maintains these mutual assistance relationships. Back at home, the afternoon is dedicated to starting the next piece of cloth, setting up the loom with new threads, beginning the weaving that will occupy the next several days. This is the cycle of her work, one piece finished and sold, another immediately begun, the continuous production that generates the income stream her family depends on. Her daughter helps with the loom setup, her small hands becoming more skilled with each repetition, her understanding of the process deepening through practice. She asks questions about thread tension and pattern consistency, the inquiries of someone genuinely learning rather than simply going through motions, and she answers patiently because teaching her daughter properly is investment in both the girl's future and potentially in their household's future if circumstances allow them to work together when her daughter is old enough to produce sellable quantities independently. The younger children play nearby, required to remain relatively quiet and contained, their presence adding background noise and occasional interruptions but not preventing the work that must continue. The middle son has reached the age where he is beginning to question why he must remain in the women's quarters when his father gets to go out and work with other men, the first signs of the gender separation that will define his life as he grows older and transitions from his mother's world to his father's. She explains that he is still young and that when he is older he will accompany his father and learn men's work, but for now he must stay and learn to be quiet and patient, skills that will serve him regardless of what work he eventually performs. He accepts this explanation with the partial understanding of a 4-year-old, not entirely satisfied but willing to comply because he has limited alternatives. The new cloth begins to take shape on the loom, the first rows establishing the pattern. That will continue for days, the foundation upon which everything else will build. This beginning is always hopeful, the clean start uncontaminated by errors or problems, though experience teaches that problems will develop and will require correction, that perfection is impossible and adequate is the realistic goal. Late afternoon brings her husband home looking tired and slightly frustrated, having found only partial day's work and therefore earning less than hoped. This is the perpetual uncertainty of day labor, some days providing full employment and good earnings, other days providing minimal work and minimal pay, the economic instability that characterizes working-class life and that makes her weaving income essential rather than supplementary. They discuss the day's earnings, his smaller amount and her larger amount combining into household budget that will sustain them for the coming days. This discussion is practical rather than emotional, simple accounting of resources and planning for expenses, the management of scarcity that requires constant attention and adjustment. The evening meal is prepared from the food purchased at market. Slightly more elaborate than usual because today's combined earnings allow small luxuries. Fish is grilled over coals, vegetables are cooked with olive oil, bread is served with cheese, the meal providing both nutrition and the occasional reminder that life includes pleasures alongside its constant demands. The family eats together. Conversation flowing easily, the children chattering about their days and the adults listening with partial attention while also managing the practical aspects of feeding small children who require constant prompting to actually eat rather than playing with their food. This is family life in its most basic form, people sharing space and food and the daily experience of survival, finding small moments of connection within the larger structure of necessity. After the meal, the evening settles into its familiar pattern, children being prepared for sleep, the day's work being concluded, preparations being made for tomorrow. Her husband mentions hearing at the Agora that work might be available tomorrow on a construction project, which is hopeful news that might mean several days of steady employment if the project actually materializes and if he is selected among the workers seeking hire. She shares her own news about the successful cloth sales and the repeat customer who promised to return, the small professional victories that make the work feel worthwhile beyond its mere economic necessity. They discuss their children's progress, the oldest daughter's improving weaving skills and the middle son's growing questions about when he can join men's work and the youngest's persistent attempts to escape supervision. These conversations are the fabric of their marriage, practical discussions about household management and children and work. the mundane content that nevertheless creates connection and partnership. They are not romantic in the way that poets describe romance, but they are partnership in the way that survival requires, two people coordinating their efforts to maintain their household and raise their children and navigate the constraints that society imposes on both of them. Though the constraints differ significantly by gender. As night deepens, she settles into the Gynecian for sleep, her body tired from the day's varied activities, the weaving and the market trip and the child management and the domestic tasks that continue regardless of other demands. Her husband settles in the main room. The separation between male and female sleeping space is being maintained as propriety requires, though in their small house this separation is more symbolic than actual, the thin walls creating the illusion of privacy rather than genuine segregation. Sleep comes gradually, her mind processing the day's events and planning tomorrow's tasks, the mental work that continues even as physical work pauses. She thinks about the new cloth being woven and how long it will take to complete and what price it might command at market. She thinks about her children and their futures, what lives await them in a city that offers limited options for people of their class and gender. She thinks about her own life, the path that led from childhood to marriage to motherhood to this moment, lying in darkness in a small house in Athens while her family sleeps around her. This life is not what childhood imagination suggests life should be, lacking adventure or romance or significant choice about its direction. But it is her life, the one she inhabits, and within its constraints she has found ways to exercise skill and judgment and to create value through her labor. The weaving she produces is real and useful, the cloth serving practical purposes for people who purchase it. The children she is raising are growing and learning and developing into the people they will become. The household she manages functions adequately, navigating scarcity through careful attention and accumulated competence. These are not grand achievements that poets celebrate, but they are achievements nonetheless, the daily victories of survival and competence that working women accumulate. She sleeps, finally, her exhaustion overcoming the tendency toward extended thought, her body claiming the rest it needs to function tomorrow. The house is quiet around her, Athens outside continuing its endless activity, but here in this small space there is temporary peace, the pause between one day's demands and the next day's similar requirements. Tomorrow she will wake and weave, and manage children and perform all the tasks that constitute her daily existence. The cloth will grow on the loom, the children will require feeding and supervision, the household will need managing, and she will do all of this competently because competence is what survival requires and survival is what she accomplishes, day after day, year after year, within the constraints that Athenian society imposes on women who must nevertheless keep households functioning and children growing and cloth being produced despite being legally non-existent persons who are supposed to remain invisible. She exists in the gap between ideal and reality, between what Athenian philosophers claim women should be and what working women actually are, between the theory that women should remain secluded and the practice that women must work publicly to sustain their families. This gap is where she lives her actual life, navigating contradictions that society creates but never resolves, making practical accommodations that allow survival despite legal and social structures designed without consideration for the realities of working women's existence, and she manages, through skill and patience and the accumulated knowledge of how to operate within constraints, making a life from the limited materials available, finding satisfaction in work done well and children raised adequately and household maintained despite odds that often seem stacked against success. This is her achievement, this daily competent navigation of impossibility, this transformation of constraint into survival, this quiet persistence in existing despite society's best efforts to render her invisible. She sleeps peacefully in this knowledge, her body resting, her mind quiet, the small victories of the day sufficient to carry her through to tomorrow's challenges. Sleep is lighter tonight than she would prefer, interrupted by the youngest child waking with some minor distress that requires soothing and settling before returning to bed. This is normal for mothers of young children, the fragmented sleep where full rest is constantly interrupted by small emergencies and minor crises that cannot wait until morning. She wakes, tends to the child, returns to bed, and tries to reclaim sleep that is now more elusive, her mind having activated and now reluctant to quiet back into unconsciousness. She lies in the darkness listening to her family breathing around her, the soft sounds of sleep that mark the house at night, her husband's deeper breathing from the main room, her children's lighter breathing from their corner, the house itself, making small settling sounds as temperature changes cause wood and clay to contract minutely. These are familiar sounds, the nighttime symphony of her domestic world, comforting in their predictability. Her mind wanders through thoughts about tomorrow's work, the weaving that is progressing steadily but slowly, the calculations about when this piece will be complete and ready for market. She thinks about the household budget, the money from yesterday's market sales and her husband's partial earnings, how those amounts distribute across rent and food and the endless small expenses that consume resources faster than they accumulate. She thinks about her children's futures, particularly her oldest daughter who is approaching the age when marriage becomes practical consideration rather than distant abstraction. In a few more years she will need a husband, and finding appropriate match requires planning and negotiation and resources that the family barely possesses. The dowry will need to be assembled from savings they do not have, or perhaps from selling goods they cannot afford to part with, the familiar problem of working families who must provide for major life transitions despite operating on narrow margins. Her son will need different preparation, training in some craft or skill that will allow him to support himself and eventually a family. Day labor is what his father does because it is what his father's limited skills allow, but perhaps her son could learn something more specialized, could apprentice to a craftsman and acquire skills that command higher pay and more stable employment. This requires finding someone willing to take him and possibly paying for the apprenticeship, another expense that seems impossible until it becomes necessary and then must somehow be managed. These nighttime worries are not productive, she knows, because worrying about future problems does not solve them and only prevents the sleep she needs to function tomorrow. But knowing this does not stop the worries from circling through her mind, the maternal anxiety about children's welfare that is apparently part of being a mother and that does not pause just because it serves no useful purpose. Eventually sleep reclaims her, pulling her back down into unconsciousness that lasts until the pre-dawn darkness begins to lighten and her internal sense tells her that lying in bed longer would mean the day's tasks becoming impossible to complete. She rises again, begins again, the eternal cycle of days that blur together in their similarity. The morning proceeds through its familiar pattern, breakfast and children and the beginning of weaving work. Her husband departs for another attempt at finding employment, hopeful that yesterday's mention of construction work will materialize into actual hiring. The children settle into their routines with varying degrees of cooperation, her oldest daughter being genuinely helpful while the younger to require constant management. The weaving continues, threads accumulating into cloth, the visible progress that makes the repetitive work satisfying despite its tedium. Her daughter's spinning has improved noticeably, the thread becoming more consistent, the skill developing through simple repetition and her mother's patient corrections. This improvement is pleasing, evidence that teaching is effective and that her daughter is genuinely learning rather than just going through motions. Around mid-morning, a neighbor appears at the door, not the widow who watches her children, but a different neighbor, a woman perhaps 10 years older who lives nearby and who is apparently in some distress. She explains rapidly that her daughter has gone into labor unexpectedly early, that the midwife they had arranged is not available, that she is desperate for any woman with experience to attend the birth because leaving her daughter alone during labor is unthinkable, but she herself has no useful skills beyond moral support. This is the reality of working-class Athens, where professional midwives exist but are expensive and where most births are attended by female relatives and neighbors who have accumulated practical knowledge through experiencing or observing multiple births. She has attended several births for neighbors and relatives, not as paid professional but as community member fulfilling the mutual obligations that bind women together in shared experiences. She cannot refuse this request, both because refusing would be unkind and because the network of mutual assistance that she depends on requires that she contribute when asked. She explains to her daughter that she must go help with a birth, instructs her to watch the younger children and to continue spinning if possible, and departs with the anxious neighbor toward another small house several streets away. The laboring Woman is young, perhaps 16, this being her first child and her anxiety therefore being both understandable and unhelpful for labor's progression. She is pacing the small room, breathing heavily through contractions, supported by her mother, who looks nearly as anxious as her daughter. The scene is familiar to her, having witnessed variations of it multiple times, the universal experience of women bringing children into the world with a mixture of pain and fear and determination. She greets the laboring woman calmly, her tone soothing and confident, projecting the reassurance that experienced presence provides. She asks questions about how long labor has been progressing, about the pattern of contractions, about whether water has broken, gathering the information needed to assess the situation. Everything suggests normal labor proceeding at normal pace, no obvious complications, just the standard difficulty and pain that characterizes bringing humans into the world. She helps the woman find positions that ease discomfort, suggests walking to encourage the baby's descent, provides the practical knowledge that she has accumulated through observation and experience. This is not medical expertise in the formal sense. She has no training beyond what other women have taught her, but it is knowledge nonetheless, real and useful and potentially life-saving in situations where complications develop, the labor progresses. Through the morning and into afternoon, the woman working through contractions with increasing intensity, her body performing the biological work of opening and pushing and accomplishing the feat that billions of women before her have accomplished. She stays throughout, providing encouragement and practical help and the simple presence of another woman who has been through this and who can confirm that what is happening is normal and that the pain will end and that the result will be worth the ordeal. The baby finally emerges in late afternoon, a boy crying vigorously and apparently healthy. She helps clean him and checks that he appears normal, finding nothing obviously concerning. The mother holds her son with exhausted joy. The pain immediately forgotten or at least transformed into something less important than the achievement of having produced new life. The grandmother cries with relief, grateful that both daughter and grandson appear healthy. She stays long enough to ensure both mother and baby are stable, to help with the initial nursing, to provide the basic postpartum instructions that might prevent complications. The family thanks her profusely, offering what payment they can afford, which is minimal but genuinely meant. She accepts a small amount because refusing entirely would be insulting, but she does not press for more because they clearly have little and because helping neighbors is obligation rather than commercial transaction. She returns home as evening approaches, having been gone most of the day, hoping that her daughter managed adequately and that the younger children did not create disasters in her absence. She finds the household in reasonable condition, her daughter having managed competently, the younger children having survived without major incidents, the weaving having been neglected but not damaged. Her daughter reports the day's events with obvious pride at having managed independently, demonstrating maturity and capability that pleases her mother even while making her slightly sad because it marks her daughter's transition from child to young woman who will soon have her own household and her own responsibilities. But this is the natural progression, children growing and leaving and creating their own lives, the cycle that continues generation after generation. Her husband returns shortly after she does, looking pleased because he was hired for the construction work and earned a full day's wages. Good news that means the family's economic situation is temporarily stable. They share the news of their respective days, the birth she attended and the work he performed, the ordinary events that constitute their lives. The evening meal is prepared and consumed, the family gathering again after the day's separation. The children tired from their day and therefore quieter than usual. After eating, the routines of settling children and preparing for sleep proceed with familiar efficiency, everyone tired and ready for rest. But before sleep, there is a rare opportunity for something different. Word has spread that tomorrow will be the festival of Thesmophoria, the women's festival honoring Demeter, one of the few occasions when women's public gathering is not just permitted but required as part of religious observance. This festival is exclusively female, men being forbidden from participating or even observing, the rare inversion of normal social order where women claim public space and men must remain excluded. She plans to attend tomorrow's festival activities, the opportunity being too valuable to miss. Thesmophoria lasts 3 days, and while she cannot afford to attend all 3 days because work cannot pause for 3 days, She can attend tomorrow's main ceremonies, the chance to gather with other women in sanctioned public space to participate in rituals that acknowledge women's importance in agricultural fertility and community continuity. This anticipation adds a different quality to the evenings settling into sleep. The knowledge that tomorrow will break the routine will provide experience outside the normal pattern of work and domestic tasks. The festival will include sacrifices and prayers and various rituals whose exact meanings she does not fully understand but which have been performed for generations and which create temporary community among women who are usually isolated in their individual households. She settles into sleep with this pleasant anticipation, the day's accumulated fatigue making sleep come easily despite the earlier interrupted night. The house quiets around her, the family surrendering to exhaustion, the night claiming them all into the temporary peace of unconsciousness. The sleep is deeper tonight, her body recovering from both the day's work and yesterday's inadequate rest, pulling her down into the profound unconsciousness that happens when exhaustion reaches critical levels. She dreams fragmentarily, brief narratives that flicker through her sleeping mind without coherence or continuity, her brain processing the day's experiences and anxieties into symbolic form. She dreams about weaving, which is unsurprising given how much of her waking time is spent at the loom. In the dream, the cloth grows impossibly fast, threads appearing and weaving themselves without her hands touching them, the magical productivity that reality never provides. She dreams about her children, seeing them as adults, her daughter married and managing her own household, her sons employed in trades she cannot quite identify in the dream's vague logic. She dreams about the birth she attended, though in the dream it becomes confused with memories of her own children's births, the experiences blending together into a general narrative of women laboring and babies emerging and the cyclical nature of human reproduction. These dreams are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply the mind's processing of experience, sorting and filing and making sense of the accumulated input of waking life. Around midnight she wakes briefly, some small sound or internal signal pulling her partially toward consciousness. She lies in the darkness for a moment, orienting herself, confirming that no actual emergency requires response, then sinks back into sleep without fully achieving wakefulness. This partial waking is normal, the way human sleep operates in cycles, rather than continuous unconsciousness, and she has long since learned not to fight it but simply to accept it as part of sleeping. The night progresses through its slow hours. The family sleeping around her, Athens outside continuing its own nighttime activities, though at reduced intensity from the daytime chaos. The occasional dog barks in the distance, the sound carrying clearly through the quiet. Somewhere a baby cries briefly then quiets, some other mother attending some other infant in some other small house. She sleeps through most of this, her exhaustion overriding the background noise, her body claiming the recovery time it needs to function tomorrow. The night is cool but not cold, the temperature comfortable under her thin blanket, autumn approaching but not yet arrived with its colder weather. Hours pass in that strange way they do during sleep, time both crawling and racing depending on whether you measure by clock time or experience time. She is unaware of any of it, lost in the depths of unconsciousness, her breathing slow and steady, her mind and body both at rest. Toward dawn she begins to sleep more lightly, her internal rhythms preparing for waking, her consciousness starting to drift upward from the deep places toward the surface. She is not yet awake, but no longer deeply asleep, hovering in that transitional state where dreams become more vivid and more easily remembered. She dreams about the festival, anticipating tomorrow's activities, imagining the gathering of women, and the rituals they will perform. In the dream, the festival is grander than she knows it will actually be, the ceremonies more elaborate, the gathering larger, her sleeping mind embellishing reality with hopes and imagination. But even in the dream, she knows that the true value of the festival is not the grandeur of the ceremonies, but the simple fact of being among other women, of claiming public space without apology, of participating in rituals that acknowledge women's importance even if only temporarily. The dream fades as dawn approaches, light beginning to filter into the room, her body recognizing that morning is coming and that sleep's time is ending. She is not quite awake yet, but moving in that direction, her mind beginning to engage with waking thoughts, her body starting to signal readiness for movement. She allows herself a few more moments of rest, lying quietly while awareness returns. fully savoring the peace before the day's demands begin. Tomorrow will bring the festival, the unusual break from routine, the opportunity to participate in something larger than her individual household's concerns. But that is tomorrow's gift. This morning now there is only the familiar routine to navigate, the weaving to continue, the children to manage, the household to maintain. But tonight she thinks with satisfaction. Tonight she will sleep well, the day's work completed, the festival attended, the small pleasures of existence claimed despite the constraints that Athenian society imposes. Tonight there will be peace and rest and the quiet satisfaction of another day survived, another small victory in the continuous campaign of managing life within limitations. She rises finally, leaving her sleeping mat, beginning another day. Ready to weave and manage and navigate whatever challenges arise, confident in her accumulated competence and in her ability to persist despite odds that often seem unfavorable. This is what she does. This is who she is, a woman finding ways to exist and to thrive within constraints, making a life from limited materials, claiming small freedoms where large freedoms are denied. The day begins, as it always begins, with her rising to meet it. The morning of the festival arrives with her waking before dawn as usual, though today carries different energy, the anticipation of attending Thesmophoria adding unusual excitement to the familiar routine. She moves through her morning preparations with extra attention, ensuring her peplos is clean and properly arranged, her appearance respectable for public religious participation. This festival is one of the few occasions when women's public visibility is not just tolerated but required, when being seen is part of proper observance rather than something to minimize. Her husband understands that today she will be unavailable for household tasks, the festival being legitimate religious obligation that even men must acknowledge and respect, though she suspects many Athenian men resent this annual disruption where women claim public space and exclude male presence. Her oldest daughter will attend with her, old enough now to participate in women's rituals and to begin learning the religious knowledge that passes from mothers to daughters. The younger children will stay with the neighbor again, the same mutual assistance arrangement that makes her various absences manageable. She prepares them quickly, delivers them to the neighbor's care, and sets out with her daughter through Athens' morning streets toward the Thesmophorion, the sacred precinct where the festival occurs. The streets are unusual this morning, filled with women moving in the same direction, a rare sight of female public presence in numbers that cannot be ignored or minimized. Wealthy women attended by slaves, working women like herself, old women and young women, all converging on the sacred space where for 3 days they will perform rituals that honor Demeter and celebrate women's role in agricultural fertility and community continuity. The gathering place is already crowded when they arrive, women settling into groups, some organized by neighborhood and some by family connections, the social networks that structure female life becoming visible in this rare public assembly. She finds women she knows from the fountain and from the market, greetings exchanged and space shared as they wait for the ceremonies to begin. Her daughter stays close, observing everything with wide eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer number of women gathered in one place, this concentration of female presence being something she has never experienced before. This is valuable education, she thinks, showing her daughter that women are not isolated individuals confined to separate households, but rather a community that can gather and claim space when circumstances permit. The first day's rituals begin, led by priestesses who have special religious authority during this festival, one of the few contexts where women exercise formal public authority recognized by the city. The ceremonies involve sacrifices and prayers, and various symbolic actions whose meanings are layered and complex, some understood and some simply performed because tradition requires them. There is something powerful about participating in rituals alongside hundreds of other women, the collective action creating feeling of community and shared purpose that daily life rarely provides. The prayers they recite together, the songs they sing, the movements they perform in unison, all of this creates temporary unity among women who are usually separated and isolated in their individual households. The festival includes elements that men would find shocking if they witnessed them, jokes and songs that are explicitly sexual, celebrations of female fertility and female power that invert the normal restrictions on women's speech and behavior. This temporary freedom to speak openly about bodies and sexuality and the realities of women's lives is both liberating and slightly uncomfortable for those unaccustomed to such directness. Her daughter looks scandalized by some of the songs, and she quietly explains that religious festivals allow behaviors that would be inappropriate in normal contexts, that temporary transgression of normal rules is part of the festival's function. This is educational in ways that go beyond the specific content, teaching her daughter that rules are not absolute, that context matters, that women together can create spaces where different rules apply. The morning progresses through various rituals and ceremonies, the gathered women performing actions that have been performed for generations, maintaining traditions whose origins are lost in time but whose continuation is considered essential for the city's prosperity. There is fasting during parts of the festival, ritual purification, symbolic sacrifices, all the elements of religious observance that connect participants to divine powers and to each other. During breaks between ceremonies, the women gather in smaller groups, sharing food and conversation, the social aspects of the festival being as important as the religious ones. She talks with women she knows, exchanges news and gossip, maintains the social connections that make urban life more manageable. Her daughter observes these interactions, learning the subtle arts of female networking that will serve her throughout her life. One conversation touches on the recent birth she attended, other women asking how mother and baby are doing, sharing their own birth stories, the universal female experience that crosses all social boundaries. Another conversation addresses practical matters of household management and market prices and the various challenges of maintaining families on limited resources. These conversations are valuable in ways that men would never understand the information exchange that allows women to navigate their constrained lives more effectively. Who is hiring for what work, which vendors offer fair prices, what remedies work for which illnesses, how to manage difficult relatives, all the practical intelligence that circulates through female networks. The afternoon brings different rituals, some performed by all the gathered women and some performed only by certain groups based on age or marital status or other categories that structure female identity. She participates where appropriate, observes where excluded, teaches her daughter the distinctions and their meanings. As the sun begins its descent toward evening, the first day's ceremonies conclude with final prayers and songs. The gathered women slowly dispersing back to their individual households, the temporary community dissolving into the separated individuals that Athenian social structure normally maintains. She and her daughter walk home together through streets that are returning to their normal male-dominated character, the unusual female presence of the morning already dissipating. Her daughter is quiet, processing what she experienced, and she lets her think rather than forcing conversation, knowing that some experiences need time for integration. They collect the younger children from the neighbor who reports adequate behavior and minimal disasters, then return to their own house where her husband has managed basic household tasks but where evidence of male household management is visible in the form of minor disorder and neglected details. She does not comment because he tried his best and because criticizing would serve no purpose, simply begins restoring order while he departs for an evening errand. The evening meal is simple, bread and olives and cheese, food that requires minimal preparation because she is tired from the day's activities and has no energy for elaborate cooking. The children eat while she tells them in simplified terms about the festival, the gathering of women and the prayers to the goddess and the rituals that honor female contribution to the city's welfare. Her husband returns and eats his own meal, asking minimal questions about the festival because men are not supposed to be too curious about women's mysteries, though she suspects this lack of curiosity is partly genuine disinterest in religious practices that exclude them and partly respect for traditions they do not fully understand. After the meal, the evening routine proceeds towards sleep, children being settled and household being prepared for tomorrow when normal rhythms will resume. Her daughter is clearly tired from the day's unusual activities, the excitement and the walking and the sheer novelty of it all combining to produce exhaustion that makes bedtime easier than usual. She herself is tired in a different way mentally. Rather than physically exhausted, the intensity of participating in communal rituals and engaging with so many people creating a fatigue that is more emotional than muscular. But it is satisfying fatigue, the tiredness that comes from meaningful activity rather than from mere drudgery. As she settles into her sleeping space, She reflects on the day's significance, the rare experience of being part of something larger than her individual household, of participating in traditions that connect her to women across Athens and across time. The generations of women who have performed these same rituals and who have found in them some measure of meaning and community. Tomorrow she will return to weaving and household management and the normal constraints of daily life, but tonight she carries with her the memory of gathering with hundreds of other women, of claiming public space without apology, of participating in rituals that acknowledge female importance even if only temporarily. This memory will sustain her through the ordinary days ahead, providing reminder that her life, while constrained, is part of larger patterns and traditions. She thinks about her daughter's experience of the festival, the girl's first participation in these mysteries, the beginning of her education into the fuller meaning of being a woman in Athens. Today her daughter saw that women are not merely isolated individuals but part of a community, that female knowledge and power exist even within structures that deny them, that traditions persist that honor women's contributions even when daily life seems to minimize them. Sleep pulls at her, the day's activities having depleted her energy, her body demanding rest. She surrenders to it willingly, knowing that tomorrow brings return to normal routine, but that tonight she can rest with the satisfaction of having participated in something ancient and meaningful, of having claimed her place in traditions that connect her to women across time. The house settles into its nighttime quiet, her family sleeping around her, Athens outside continuing its eternal activity. She sleeps deeply, peacefully, her mind carrying images from the festival, the gathered women and the rituals performed and the temporary community created. This is her life, these cycles of ordinary work and rare extraordinary moments, these patterns of constraint and occasional freedom, these rhythms of domestic labor and community participation. She manages it all with accumulated competence, finding meaning in small pleasures and large traditions, claiming what agency she can within limitations imposed by society. She is an Athenian woman, working and weaving and raising children, legally invisible but practically essential, constrained by gender but finding ways to persist and thrive within those constraints. Her life is not what philosophers describe when they theorize about ideal cities and ideal citizens, but it is real and lived and meaningful in ways that philosophy often fails to acknowledge. She sleeps now, deeply and peacefully, having earned this rest through her labor, deserving this peace through her persistence. Tomorrow will bring new work and new challenges, but tomorrow is not yet here. Tonight there is only sleep, only rest, only the quiet darkness where she is simply herself, a tired human being recovering from a day well lived, preparing through rest for more days to come. That's the essence of ancient Greek life. With that, I wish you a calm night.